Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining me on this new course, an introduction to scripting pages and the SDK resources. This is really all about the way in which we're going to be able to take all of the knowledge that we have about business rules, all of the knowledge we have about the way in which CRM's architecture works, and starting to move to a position where we can to create our own extensions to Sage CRM. Now, this course, an introduction to scripting pages and the SDK resources, has been added into the program because many people observed that we went straight in. We assumed that we had knowledge of JavaScript and went straight into ASP pages, and people didn't have a background of the idea of scripting within pages and some of the concepts that are there. So this course is trying to straddle the gap. So moving into a new programming environment should be very easy. Now, why are we actually running this course? Well, scripting pages, although they are straightforward, and hopefully you will agree that JavaScript is not a particularly hard language to understand. It is a simple enough to get going language once you know the concepts, and especially forgiving with the idea that it's a loosely typed language. But we've already seen that the fact that it's case sensitive and it can be quite pernickety in some areas, but actually it's generally straightforward to learn. And Sage CRM has these variety of different programming environments, but ASP pages, which we're going to see in a moment, are quite classic in their age. You know, they go back to the 1990s. They nevertheless are still very useful because what is very common nowadays is the idea of being able to use JavaScript within the server to allow us to perform server-based action. So JavaScript still is a very valid way of coding interactions with the database and with web services, because a lot of the movement into business rules between systems now are going into services that are invoked through JavaScript. And although in this course, as we're teaching it at the moment, we're going to be emphasizing really the idea of scripting for classic ASP pages that extend Sage CRM's main interfaces, so new screens to support custom entities. They actually, and we'll also extend that to look at the idea of creating integrations with corporate websites through the use of self-service. Interestingly, you know, we're using scripting within JavaScript files more and more because of integration with ERP systems and accounting systems within Sage. We have got a series of articles on the community site, and we also see that we've got a series of videos specifically about the way in which the X3 integration works. Now, I've just got a small note indicating that there might be a problem with sound. Hopefully that's not the case, and I wonder if somebody could quickly give me a sound check. Could somebody indicate whether you can hear me loudly and clearly? So it looks like people can hear me. Good. Very good. Good. Right, well, sorry, to carry on with this. So we've got this environment which looks a bit old, but actually is still valid, it's still good, it's still quite hot because of the use of JavaScript to provide scripting environments. And if you look around technology-wise, quite a lot of people still use forms of JavaScripting within the server. We are going to look implicitly and explicitly at many of these different points that we've got here. We're going to be moving through and considering what are ASP pages. We'll be considering how they can be used or why they're used within CRM. We'll be looking at where we can look for further information about the use of the ASP pages, we'll probably have a look at the idea of ASP versus ASPX, but really that's something that crops up much more in the context of web services and in the context of the conversation about .NET. So I might actually leave that until the subsequent lessons. But we'll have to understand a lot of the terminology that scripting pages use and the idea that there is a typical structure of an ASP page that you might want to create within inside CRM. And most of what I'm going to be talking about is thinking about the usage of CRM within, or usage of ASP pages within a CRM environment. There's not much point in talking about ASP pages in isolation. So we'll look at structure, we'll look at the idea of the way in which include files are used, we'll look at the way in which cascading style sheets produce a standard appearance for the files, and we'll understand how we can move and copy information around. So all of this will involve, no doubt, me creating some errors, and so that'll give a sense of the way in which we can start to solve problems, especially around the idea of formal catching of errors using the try-catch mechanisms. And of course we'll be then looking ahead into where else are we going to be using these ASP pages. So one of the obvious things to state is that JavaScript is used throughout Sage CRM, and we want to be able to have a consistent approach between the scripting that we write within the browser, the scripting that we write within table level scripts, the scripting that we want to use for extending CRM. So ASP pages provide us with this mechanism so that if we are starting to create some behavior that extends a screen or adds in a new entity that might have features such as needing to format a particular field, then we can reuse function libraries perhaps from the scripting environments that we've already seen, like the idea of the table level scripts scripting common functions, or from script libraries that are used in the custom content and on change events. Now ASP is the example of the scripting pages that we use, and it stands for Active Server Pages, and it is an extension that is actually a filter running inside IIS. What that means is that when IIS is running and a request comes in to an ASP page, the web server identifies the type of file. So we're used to the idea of an HTML file being created, and we'll see, we'll go ahead and create that in a moment. And when we run the ASP page, we will find that because it's an ASP page, it will then parse the contents of the file through the filter to process the script that is contained within that. It's a runtime, so it runs as it's requested. Now the technology is old in that it was introduced in 1996, and it isn't a language as such, it is a technology because you could use a variety of different language, and it's a way in which we can combine ASP, HTML and any other tags and text into the same file. Sage CRM, if we think about the way in which our architecture works, has come from an environment, and this is the original sort of environment that we're working with, where requests from the browser come into the web server. So everything has the origin in the idea of an HTTP request, comes into the web server, and the web server would then be passing through to the eWeb DLL. Well, ASP pages sit listening to the web server so that we call an ASP page through a hyperlink through the menu structures of CRM, And as we call the ASP pages through the menus at CRM, we will be passing it variables, and the ASP page will be processed by the web server so that it can instantiate a COM or common object model COM object into the active server page that allows it direct interaction with the eWare DLL. So the ASP pages gain the richness of the CRM object that we've used already within inside all of the different scripting environments. But of course, just as we saw that there's a difference between the scripting environment within the create scripts and table level scripts and validate scripts, so there is a difference in the way in which we can script inside ASP pages. But it is very much, and just emphasizing the fact that I've just put in there the newer technology. It is older technology that we're looking at, but that is not saying that it's redundant. In fact, it's the same basic technology that we would use for .NET as well, and it's the same basic technology that is used in the new generation of integrations with the accounting systems that we're using, just because it's such a flexible and useful tool to allow us to work with those different endpoints and different forms of environment. We're going to create now a simple file just to go through the process of looking at the definition of a resource. So I'm going to bounce across into my development environment. You can see here I'm using Visual Studio. And I'm going to create here a hello world file. So let's type in hello world. And I will save this as, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Let's call this intro. And I'll call this intro.htm. So I have a very simple file that all it's going to do, it contains structure. Now, you probably know that really, if you're dealing with HTML, you should always format your documents correctly so that it contains all of the information to structure the HTML perfectly well. But I'll show you in a moment that the actual browsers are actually very forgiving. So if I go and browse to that, and that, by the way, what I've done is I've put this down on underneath the folder here underneath custom pages. This is just the way in which the web server is set up. I will be looking at the setup of web servers in the course of the discussion about self-service. So I'm not going to steal any of that thunder. I just want to look at the fact that I've put this down where the web server expects to be able to find files. And Sage CRM expects to find its ASP pages and other resources underneath the custom pages folder. That's just a given. And so if I go into where I've got my local hosts, Sage CRM, in here I'm going to go underneath custom pages, but this time I'm going to look for intro.htm. So if I type intro.htm, you can see I get my hello world coming back. Now, the normal way that we would use a file and incorporate that file into CRM, and this is necessary in order to start thinking about how we shape and use the files. If we go in to log on into CRM, remember this is what I want to get across is that anything that we're doing is I have to put it into the context of how these files are used within a CRM environment. And although this is a general topic that anyone can construct these types of scripting files. They're not the most common way in which you would do that now. If you're building your own website, you'd probably use a different technology, but as it is, this is a superb way of being able to extend CRM. And I'm going to just tuck that, just come into my menu structures and come into advanced customization. What I want to do is tuck into the system menus, into the My CRM menu, a new option. And I'm going to call this intro. So there's my intro, and I want to invoke a custom file, and in this case this is intro.htm. Now, as far as the path is concerned, it's going to assume that the path is underneath the custom pages folder. That's just the way it is. So I put intro in here, and I add that, and I can choose save. So if I log on as another user, so if I log on just so that I can see this, and I will log on as Susan May. On my menu, you should see that I've got a intro button that if I click on this, I get a hello world. Now, I gradually want to move to a position where my hello world is properly formatted within the structure of a page that makes it look like CRM. So why don't I have the menu structures and other things to show me on this page? Well, that'll come by the end of the session, so looking at the idea of how we wrap and construct the page. But let's click on this again. If I click on intro, can you notice, because I'm in the context of CRM, it's wrapped in and it's given me a lot of information within the URL. So it's not the same as just calling it inside the browser. It's the CRM is always wanting to assume it's passing in some additional stuff. Now I can change my file. I can go back inside here, or not inside here, but inside here, and I can start to change this into an ASP page. And the reason I want to change it into an ASP page is because I want to look at the way in which processing takes place. Because at the moment, what we've got within our HTML file is that our browser makes a request to the web server, which loads the HTML file which is sent to the browser, but at the same time then caches that HTML file. So subsequent fetches of the HTML file won't need to reload it. So it's just a way that the web server will keep that served up until the session drops out of memory. In the case of an ASP page, it's very easy to do this. If I look at this and I change this now and do save intro as, I can change and save this as an ASP page. Now this is an ASP page, and I need to just alter my tab again, just so that now I'm calling, instead of an HTML file, I'm calling the ASP page. So I've come back into administration, I've come into the advanced customization area and the system menu, which I was altering, and I'm now altering the file that I had added in earlier on to call an HTML file to call an ASP page. And just I need to update that and choose save. And this file is working. So if I change where I've got my intro.asp, HTML into intro.asp, we can see that it's still doing exactly the same thing. And in here, if I go back to look at the menus and I now click on the menu again, and what we see, oops, I hadn't actually refreshed that page. That was a bit silly of me. Let's actually refresh my page. And so now click my intro, and you can see that I've called here my intro.asp, and it's being passed the same variables again as the HTML file was calling. But the thing is that that ASP page has been parsed by the web server. If I go and look at the web server, you can actually see that we have got our ASP module added into the web server, and that's part of the setup of a web server. You have to have the capability within your web server to be able to process and run ASP pages if you want to be able to use CRM. And by the way, they're used in all sorts of little odd places. So for example, even our interactive dashboard, if I go back onto the interactive dashboard, that you'll find that inside this environment where we have, our interactive, I seem to have gone and lost my, oh no I hadn't, of course I was in the wrong tab then, let's shut you down. Even when we're working with an interactive dashboard, these frames, for example, that contain the individual gadgets are called up in the context of ASP pages, and they're useful to serve up these structures. Okay, I've been talking for 20 minutes or so. Let's see if anyone has got any questions or any concerns about what I've been saying. Doesn't look like anyone has spotted any deliberate mistakes so far, so this is very good. Let's actually just tuck that away. And I'm just, when I say tuck that away, I mean I'm pushing my my little panel that tells me what you're saying or what you're doing out of sight, so that I stop spying on you and I can get on with the class. The next thing that I want to do, if we've seen this, is to probably sort of have an explore about how we can take this idea of the ASP pages and start to make them useful within CRM. And that's going to be, we're going to have to introduce some more little things about the objects that are available to us and how those objects are used. ASP pages are in themselves completely unimportant. What is the most important thing is metadata. We know that metadata is important, and we will see very clearly in the next lessons when we come on to building our own extensions that suddenly it is the metadata that is doing the heavy lifting. We know that in a way because we already know how run block, and we've done some codeless customization to be able to demonstrate that all we need to do is describe how a database connection works, how a table connection works, how a field is labeled and described, and how a screen and a list is built. And then we only have to invoke those within the context of the interface and everything works. Well, that idea of connecting through to an external data source actually can be extended within the context of Sage CRM and accounting applications to include web services connections. And that's actually something that is the mechanism that sits behind the integration with X3, for example. So a custom page is here. When we use an ASP page, we're ultimately going to be looking at calling and invoking the metadata. And that metadata is accessed through libraries which are not they're not ASP libraries. They are in fact a library of objects which come from within the CRM object itself, and it's registered inside the server as a COM object which we can then invoke. So we instantiate our object inside the ASP page, and we can then use it in the context of the generation of the interface. Now ASP pages perfectly capable of generating dynamic web pages, processing HTML forms, interacting with the database, all through this idea of simple script. And the advantage for us within a consultancy environment for CRM or even a development environment is that it is extremely simple. We're talking about being able to construct pages which are list pages. By combining the objects inside CRM, you can get complex interfaces built in really half a dozen lines of code, not much code at all. It's about a consistency, though, where we are wanting to implement particular business rules. We have consistency in language between our internal scripting, like table level scripts, and the browser scripting, and the possibility of sharing libraries between those environments. So it's really to do with simplicity, consistency, and also producing something that, although it's simple, it is still nevertheless very accessible to a human. So you could have something that is simple and people don't really understand what's going on, but you can actually create things which are quite readable and understandable as well. And when you come back to this, now that makes it easy to change and to update. That has itself, you know, it's not just an advantage, it can be a disadvantage for some people, because we have to face up to the fact that protecting ASP pages from accidental change or malicious change can be a little bit difficult if people get access to the server, in the sense that if a system administrator deletes a line of code, they can play havoc with the action of the ASP page. It's not the same within, say, a .NET DLL, which is a fixed deliverable which can't be changed. It's not human readable in the product that is delivered. But one of the other strengths of development with this is that it is simply drop-in deployment. There's no IIS reset required. I can just change the page and it works. It just works. So if I look where we've got our ASP page here, and you can see there's the hello world. If I go back to the contents of this page and I type in hello all and I refresh this, you can see immediately the change is reflected within the interface that is delivered to me. So we have here the idea that there's as there's change and you deploy, there's no reset, it's hot droppable and it's immediately usable. And the types of work that we're going to do with this is that we're going to create all the sorts of typical actions that we carry out within inside CRM. So everything that you look at within inside a CRM environment, and let's go back actually to a CRM environment. So if I go and look at a company page, just about everything that you see here can be rebuilt and restructured within an ASP page. And by the way, whatever I say about an ASP page can be done inside .NET, for example, as well. So I can construct construct summary pages, I can construct list pages, I can then look at the process of creating new pages and insert pages and so on. So all of the different actions can all be constructed inside the CRM environment, all in ASP pages. When it comes on to the design of this, we just have to think about the flows that we would want. Here, of course, when I go back onto the My CRM menu and I look at the intro here, of course, I'm thinking about where I'm going to invoke this page. So what part of the hardest, or I should say, partially the hardest thing, you know, it's a debate as to which is actually the hardest thing, but I think one of the hardest things to do within the design of or the implementation of a new entity within inside CRM is actually deciding where you're going to invoke it, how you're going to move, and what are the navigational points, because that will decide how many pages you end up creating. After all, you might find you move from the main menu, go to a find menu, from the search you go on to you have to have pages that will handle that result page to link off to list, and so on, you see the fact that there's lots of different searches with repeated elements within those pages. Now, I've started already to create a script page, and we know that it is just essentially HTML that we're going to create. So let's look at taking it a little bit further away from where I've just done this to looking at the basic structure of an ASP page. So this is where we're actually going to get going into writing this. I think that we need to understand a little bit about what the page offers in the or part of the structure that the page can have. Pages can be built so that they include files, drawing from information from within inside the system, and in order to help build those files, we can use snippets, so that you can use it within inside an IntelliSense environment to quickly construct the code that we want. So this is all good. There's the environment that I'm using here. If I start creating a JavaScript file, we will see that I can right mouse click, insert snippet, and inside the code snippets I've got a range of different ASP snippets that I can use. So we've got all these different things that we can use, which are specific methods or objects for Sage CRM. They're not general to ASP pages. We've got an environment that supports HTML, client-side and server-side JavaScript. So let's go and do this. Here is my ASP page. Up to now, everything that I've written has been rendered inside the browser, and anything that I pass can be rendered inside the browser. So inside here within the body, I can put in some other script, and here I could say window.alert, and in here I can say hello world again. You can see that I'm suffering from a severe lack of imagination at this point, but here I'm saying hello world, and if I refresh this page, you can see that the hello world has come up. So a ASP page can consist of HTML, client-side JavaScript, but this is script that is run inside the browser. We can also choose to have script executed within the server. A convenient way of doing this is to indicate that what we're writing here is going to write a little bit of JavaScript that we've got, and I can put this, and what will happen is that those script tags will be interpreted as saying script run at equals server, and so it will run this script there. And if I use response.write and I say this is created on the server, we'll see that we're using a server-side method. So if I refresh that now, oh, actually, there you go. You can see that there was an expected end of statement, and I think that what I've done is I've mixed languages there. So if I refresh that, yes, I had mixed languages. That was not so good because, of course, I had put in a semicolon, which is very much a JavaScript way of working. What I've just done there, you probably don't realize it, but that is actually VB script. It looks a lot like JavaScript, but it is in fact VB script. What I've now got is a little bit of script that is taking place on the server, and you saw it fired after everything else had been served up within the page. I can prove that the environment is very different, because if I was to take this particular statement, the window.alert, and try and run that on the server, it wouldn't work. And if I tried the response.write, it wouldn't work with inside the browser. So it just would fail. So in the case of this, let's invoke this, and we will see that there are mistakes. So one is ignored within the browser mistake is ignored, response.write is suppressed, but the server can't suppress that. It's trying to use the window.alert, and it's saying that on line 15 object is required, and if we come down here, it doesn't know what the object window is. So this is telling us that we have to be mindful about the location that we're writing our code, and that code has a very distinct flavor based on whether we're writing on the server or whether we're writing in the browser. So we know that I've just started to demonstrate that scripting language that I used was VBScript. By default, the language that the server expects to use is actually VBScript. You can see that. Don't go changing your web server's language, because you may actually have all sorts of unforeseen incidents, because it assumes that the language is VBScript, and if no language is mentioned, then and you try and change it, and if it was running it as VBScript, you would get into a state. We will see in a moment that we can invoke ActiveX components, and they can be containing ADO for ActiveX data objects, or in the case of CRM, a CRM object, and we'll want to incorporate those in the code that we write. Now, we've also seen now the idea that in addition to regular HTML tags, which might include script, we are also using server-side scripts delimited using the angle bracket %. So that indicates that those scripts are executed in the server using the particular language. Now, if we write in JavaScript, it has a different look and implementation of the language other than in VBScript. You can see the object convention on server-side JavaScript is to call the objects in with a capital R and capital W. You saw that in the code that I wrote there, it was in VBScript lowercase r and w. How do we get to the point where we can start writing in JavaScript? Well, what we have to do is start thinking about using include files. And this is where I'm going to be a little bit dramatic. What I'm going to do, I'm going to pick up the code that I've got here so far within my body, just copy that, and then I'm going to get rid of everything. So I'm going to get rid of my ASP page contents, and I'm going to now go and say I want to insert an HTML snippet, because I'm going to use a custom page outline. And what we're starting to move to is the idea of what the include files offer us. So I'm using an idea of an intro.js file here as well. Now, these include files are used to extend the functionality of any one individual page. So if you've got a bit of canned behavior that you keep repeatedly using, the server-side include can do that. Now, they can be used for lots of different purposes, and this slide talks about putting in directives, but actually the chief thing that we might want to do is to look at the way in which we can invoke our own behavior. And if I create a new page, just for myself, and this time create it as a JavaScript file and save that here. Oops, no, I don't want to save that just yet. I want to right mouse click, insert JavaScript, and insert my code snippets. And actually no, I'll do that. I'll stick to that for the moment. I'll come back to making it a little bit more complex. Let's stick to simple for a moment. Let's just put in my delimiters to indicate that this JavaScript actually runs on the server. I can put in this code. So my include file now includes all that code that I originally copied from the other item. And this file I'm saving as intro.js. So I've got a file called intro.asp which includes intro.js. It actually does something else as well. You can see in here it's including sagecrm.js. This is the idea of the ASP include files. And the job of the include files is several things can actually happen, and by looking at the first one we'll actually understand what they can do. Remember, we've just mentioned that the include files can include directives to the server. Here you can see a directive telling the server to say process this page using JavaScript. So this changes the language of the page to JavaScript, and we can also see here it's doing another job, which is then including yet another file. This other file itself starts to do more stuff. And if we look at the more stuff that this is doing, the work that it's doing is doing some work with a response object, which we've already started to glimpse at within the response.write, plus it's using other ideas like the server variables and the request object, which we'll be looking at in a moment, and the idea of creating objects on the server using the server object, and we'll be looking at that in a moment. But take the idea that what we've got here is the creation of an object that is being passed information from the HTTP request. Then this is the mechanism by which we start to open up and access, instantiate in other words, the CRM object that we can then use for the processing of business rules inside CRM. So really, although we're going to be covering in this course mostly the idea of the core ASP objects, it really doesn't make sense without inside CRM unless we can use the CRM objects. The importance of this, though, is that we know we have to call our pages in the context of CRM. If I look now at my ASP.page, I'm invoking and including my JS file and the intro.js file. This JS file has got a number of problems because it's a JavaScript file, and I've got some nonsense. So we're going to meet some errors. We're going to meet quite a few errors, and the first error that we come across, if I refresh this page again, is that we have got now a sense that the object is undefined. I just need to make sure that's actually properly refreshed. So let's have a look at my CRM, and I go back into intro, and we can see that we've got a JavaScript runtime error this time. Response is undefined, and it tells us which line that it's failed at. Now here we can change this so that it is correctly writing out. This is the point in which the client side, that wouldn't have generated that error that you saw in here because this is not the right line, but typically what happens within browser errors is that they are suppressed. We just don't see those unless we happen to open up the console, as you can see, and you can start to see that response is not defined within the browser console. If I look though through here, I change my response.write to the correct capitalization and choose save. What we'll now do is move on the error into the next point, because now the error is saying window is undefined and that object doesn't exist on the server. So let's just get that line out of the picture. I'm going to comment it out. So commenting out lines is exactly the same inside the ASP pages and inside a JS file that is server-side executed as it is inside what we know about inside the browser, etc. So I refresh that once more, and this time we can see all this is created on the server. So we now have a working page. Or do we? Because if I take that idea, remember when I used it first, I was able to go into intro.asp and use it out of the context of CRM, because I actually went into intro.html or HTM first of all, didn't I? If I just change that to ASP, what we'll find is that we now get a very typical error inside a CRM environment. This typical error is not an ASP error. This error comes from the fact that the object that we want to use has failed to be instantiated correctly. This is down to the line 39. I almost know that number off by heart. If we come into our CRM nolang required and look down here, we can see, come here, you can see that I'm on line 38. 39 line is this CRM int. So this method, which is of the CRM object that has just been instantiated here, is failing because it hasn't been passed certain information. Now the information that it wants is actually all of the good richness that comes from the environment that CRM is when it's called from the menu. So this is telling us that the CRM objects that we want to use inside ASP pages don't make sense unless they're in the context of the CRM menus. Okay, does anyone have any questions or concerns so far? You're all very quiet, and I don't know whether you're stunned or not. No questions coming in? Good, Michelle. Yes, it's amazing that you now know what the angle bracket percent means. So that's good. That's good. Otherwise, if you're just looking at things like if you're just looking at code, it starts to form. It's a definition of magic, isn't it? This is just indicating that the script is executed when it's parsed within the server. And I can now start to take you into discussing some of the actual objects of the ASP environment, because they're used a lot by the pages that we write for CRM. Now our objects are we're going to know about methods and properties, and they'll also meet things called collections. First of all, let's meet our ASP server object. I've brought this into being the thing that we deal with first of all, because of course this is, if you like, the most important thing that happens with any of our pages, and that is the instantiation of this object. So this is the way in which any ActiveX object is going to be created within inside an ASP page. We create the object here. Now, if you are going to look around and create all sorts of different objects, do make sure that it is the object that is designed for instantiation within a server rather than in a browser or in a Windows shell environment. You've got to make sure that it is the correct object for the environment. But we've got create object allowing us to get hold of our registered CRM DLL and be able to then be able to use all of the objects within that. Now, our pages are constructed in an environment in which there are going to be HTTP requests and HTTP responses. And the response object is the object that allows you to control the way in which we send information back out. And the response object has a range of different collections, properties, and methods. I'm not going to cover everything. I'm just going to have to concentrate on the things that are relevant or most relevant for working with CRM things. And there are three things I think I want to mention here. The first that I want to look at in terms of the properties is that I want to talk about expiring pages. If we look into the top of the include file, this CRM nolang, you can see that we've got a response.expires. What this is saying is that when we're using a page inside the CRM environment, and let's go back into the CRM environment, oops, I'm in the wrong place. Let's go back into the CRM environment. If we were moving around and this opportunities list happened to be an ASP page, I wouldn't want that cached so that next time I clicked it, it only returned 3 rows. I actually want it to always go in and get me the latest data. So it's not remembering anything on the server when that last resource was fetched. So this is an important idea that we want to be able to expire immediately. So the -1 indicates that that's the case. The next thing that we meet is the idea of the methods which include write and redirect. The other methods are again allowing you to buffer out our output, but in fact what we will see is that really mostly what we want to do is just use the CRM objects to control the page, except for when it comes to the final writing out of the page or the redirection. If I create another simple page, and let's create another simple page. I'm going to create a JavaScript page here. I'm going to cheat when I come to save it, because I'm going to use the idea of the server-side redirect. I'll write this out. And what else do I want to write? I'm going to say percent response dot redirect. And where do I want to go? I want to go to intro.htm. Put that in quotes. So I'm going to redirect to a new location when this page is requested. I'll just save this as let's call it notme.asp. So you can see that I've saved that here. I've got an ASP page. It's recognized these as server-side scripts, very clearly showing that. And here, if I put in a URL, I go into my local host, I go into custom pages, and I type in notme.asp, and we watch what happens. We should see that we've ended up on the intro.html or HTM page. So this is a way in which we would which we would redirect. And what we will be doing is using this when we come on to these lessons inside the ASP. When we come on to discuss ASP pages in detail with inside CRM, we'll be using that method to allow us to change our page once a record has saved to a particular page. So we might want to move from, as soon as you've deleted a record, let's go and put it onto the list page. As soon as you've inserted a record, let's redirect from the insert page into the summary page. So we've got the need to be able to control a redirect. Now, there's another thing that we can do, of course, which is the response.write, and we've already been doing that as we look at our intro. We know about response.write. I've got to develop that idea a little bit further in our discussions, because response.write takes us so far, but within a CRM environment, we have to maintain our context all the time. Context is one of those things which is big inside CRM, because we want to be able to ensure that we produce the information that we want. So let's consider now the idea of a request object. The request object is this moment in which we, or this attempt to describe the interaction that comes from the browser. It's a little bit more than that, because if we think about the architecture of our ASP page, the ASP page sits within the context of the web server. The request must come to the web server first of all. The request then has to be passed by the web server to the ASP page because of that the nature of the request. The ASP page sits on the IIS server. So you actually get quite a lot of information about the entire request and the web server itself, potentially within the request object. And this request object gives us mechanisms to get whole stacks of information. The first thing that we need to get to grips with is the sense that we can understand what's going on within the query string. So if I go back into my page here, I'm going to just get rid of my client-side stuff, because I don't want this. I just want to stick with my server-side goodness here. And I'm going to change this a little bit, because what I want to do is to say, well, what SID have I got? So I'm going to say, what is my session ID? So I'm going to say var in here, my SID is equal to, and I then say request dot query string, and in the query string, this is where I need to put in the name of the variable that we're going to read. So this is thinking about where we go into my CRM and we go into intro, and of course this is the old page, by the way, that this is the unsaved change, but this is the information I want to read, the SID from the URL. So that's what I've got in here. I save this page, or save this file, which of course is loaded within the context of the ASP page, and I run this again, and we can say that this is created on the server, and that hasn't refreshed. Why hasn't that refreshed in my... Oh, because I haven't done anything with the SID. So actually I now want to move to use that in here. So I've got now the idea I'm reading the SID and I'm writing it back out. And if I refresh this, we can see that it's now writing the SID. And of course that is the SID. So if I go into sysadmin, we can see that it is correctly reading the session ID for that particular user. So the user who's accessing this page, I can get access to any of the information within the URL. That itself can be used to build URLs as well. And this sense of the query string providing the context is what we see being passed into the object down here, the idea that we must be able to read the query string of all of that different contextual information. It becomes easy, or it is easy to use within our ASP pages. It comes a little bit more tricky when we think about the nature of a request object, because forms make the request using a different HTTP verb. Normally when you're making a request with using a URL, you're making a GET, and when you make a request using a form, you make a POST. Certainly that's the way it is inside CRM. I know if you're going to be absolutely precise with me, you would be able to say that there are, of course, there are 7 different HTTP, I think it might be 7 or 9 different HTTP methods that could be used, including delete and input, but yes, put, get, delete, and we are using post and get. Well, what we're going to do is create another little ASP page that can be called within the interface so that it has knowledge of where it is, and then posting information in. So we can then have this work. Here, I should say, I'm going to create a new HTML file. And this HTML file I will actually, I'll leave as that. That's probably fine to leave with all that HTML in place. But I will bring in my little declaration of which language is being used. So I want that file in here. So this is my page, and I'm going to run up and say, on the server, we're going to use JavaScript for this file. And this is an example of a unitary ASP page. So everything is going to be contained inside here. And what I want to be able to do is to create within my body a form. So here, this is going to be form action is going to submit to a particular page, and I think I want to submit this to my intro page. So I'm going to say intro.asp. Now we're going to see that we've got to develop this idea a little bit further, because we'll need to look at building and including variables into this as we construct our page. So there's our form action intro.asp, and the next thing that I want to do is to say that the method is going to be here, post. So there's our form starting to be built, and I want to include some inputs. So some very simple inputs. So input type equals, and in this it's going to be just a text box, and I'm going to give this a name. Let's give you a name that is familiar to you, like pers underscore first name, and then we'll add in another input, and this time let's call this input type equals text, and this will have a name as well, and we'll call this pers underscore last name. Oops, and after that we can also put an input for the submit. So input type equals submit. So I've got a very simple form here, and it will submit its request to the intro page. And I'll call this, let's call this my form, let's call this my form PM, so it's in the afternoon class that I'm calling this, so I'll call that an ASP page. My form.pm.asp. Well, this is insufficient as it is, but it's going to start the process. It'll show us what this looks like, and I need to call this again from within inside a menu. And I want to do that so it is properly wrapped with the information. So I go in here into custom file and I call this, what did I call this? My form PM, my form PM.asp, and I add that, oops, my form, I add that, and I'll put it next to the intro page. I'll actually move it up to the above it and choose save. So now within the interface, if I go back into the main interface and look at the summary area, if I go into just look at summary opportunities for the moment, and you can see that I've got my form and the intro. If I go into my form, there is the very simple form. I didn't say it was going to look attractive, but there we can see that we've got two fields. We also see that we're fully wrapped with the information that makes up the query string. If I put in my name now into this field and hit submit, it's going to submit it, and we'll see that the form, the address bar changes to the intro.asp page, but we've now got the error message that we saw before. So what's wrong? Why are we getting this error on line 39 of the CRM nolang.js file? Well, here you should really know. This is where, if we went back into looking at the CRM nolang and down to line 39, we will find that this is really all about the initialization of the object. So we've got some problem here in the way in which this CRM object is being instantiated. And what it is of course, if we look back to our browser, we can see that we no longer have any of the URL information that we were expecting. Because of course, if we call the intro page from the menu, there is no problem. It works, we see it, but we're missing this information. So where's that information coming from? Well, at this point we can start to think about it coming from the query string. If I look to my myform.asp page again, let me just sort of look at the idea of writing something out. I'm going to do a little bit of code here. So I write out my code within the ASP page, and what I want to do is to say let's do a response dot write, and I'm going to say I want to write out request dot query string. So here I'm not writing out SID on its own. I just want to write out the entirety of the query string. So I save that, and now if I look at my form, what we can see is we've got the SID being written out. What happens if we were to take that as a variable and append it to the action that we see down here? Now this becomes actually a trick that we use a lot within CRM, that the action or the redirect that we go to, we control using query string to allow us to read the information so we can build our path correctly. So let's write that into a variable. And so I say in here var my string is equal to that. Here I can say, because if we look back on here, it didn't include the question mark, so in here I put the question mark in place. I can then add in some JavaScript at this point. I can add in some JavaScript at this point that is executed in the server, and I just want to put in my string. That should work. So if I refresh this, oh no, it didn't like that. Let's go and write out my response dot write choose save, and we are not working. Why are we not working? What's wrong? What have I failed to do in here? Because that's a plus. No, I think this is going to be wrong as well. That's wrong. Query string. Oh, that's the why. That's the wherefore. If I read my errors, that helps, doesn't it? If I read my errors, and nobody was chipping in, were you? Were you chipping in? Extra bracket. There you go. Derek Fitzpatrick gets the extra prize from this one. Oh, and so does Jeremy as well. So two clever people there. So I have actually I've started to do too much clever customization of this. Let's go back into doing what that was. Should be able to write out my variable in here. And if I right mouse click and view the page, we now see, in fact, we've got it literally writing out that, so I need to just change that so it's concatenated with the string. So I need to come back into here, and I think I could probably get rid of that, and now process the page again. Right mouse click, view page source, and here you can see that we've got our URL built. So will it work? If I now type in my name, will I get an error? In fact, it doesn't error, it works neatly, but still I've got to then get that information which has been submitted as part of a post. So I've got my page. Did everyone understand that? Did everyone understand the mess that I made of that then? Well, I didn't make a mess of it, but did everyone understand what we've done there? This is just that equals is a quick way of saying writing out a variable rather than having to do a response.write. Looks like everyone is okay with that. In which case what we can do is we can jump back into where we had the intro.asp, which I've got my response.write, and now I can say, well, var my name is equal to, and here I use the form object to be able to read the submitted information. Now, request.form is what we do nearly all the time when we're doing things like self-service, and we use it very frequently within the context of the some of the pages where we want to capture additional information that is not necessarily obvious. So request.form pers underscore first name, and I concatenate that with the next object. And that's going to be my last name. So whoops, and there's my bracket there. So I save that and then do a response dot write, and I'm writing out my SID. No, not my SID, my name. Look at that, my name. That would have been very confusing if I'd seen that. So if I can now go back to the form, here's my form, I submit this, and you can see that it has not only read the session ID, but I've been able to read and work with the posted information. When I submitted it, where did it go? Is it just hanging in a cloud somewhere? Well, actually, where I posted it into the file here. So in my target, if I look at the source again, we can see that the action is to invoke the ASP page, and we can see the SID. Now let's compare that. Actually, if I look at what we do within a real CRM form, if I jump across to look at the new opportunity page, for example, right mouse click and view source here, and I go down and have a look at my form in here, form name, and you can see our form, which is called entry form, and you see it's called with the method post, and its action is sending it and submitting it to the eWare DLL. So when we post in eWare, you post to the also post in CRM, you post to this eWare DLL, and when we're posting within an ASP page, the action that you've defined within that page, in this case my form here, is going to define where that goes. So it's that intro.asp page and its include file intro.js, which I've written here, which is then saying, I'm going to do this work. Now that work is no more than simply to collect the information that has been submitted, but because you can see that I've collected the information, you can reason that we would then be able to go on and do whatever we liked with other objects to perhaps submit it into the database or do other work. Does that make sense, Michelle? Did that explain what's happening within the relationship of the post? Okay, well, you said okay, yes. I wouldn't give you a chance. Is that a definite yes, I understand, or no, I'm still not quite sure? Yes, good. Okay, that's more definite. Good, good, I like that. So we've got a sense of how the information is entered in using the ASP pages. So let's switch back into what we've got in here. We've looked at our request.form. We can get even cleverer with the stuff that we've done. We know about how to grab our first name, we know how to grab our last name, and we've seen the work that we have to do. There is some other stuff that in ASP pages you might want to work with. So you might have heard, and when you're looking around at sites like W3 Schools, for example, you might come across people talking about the session object to allow you to store information between pages as you're working through it. But the session object is not something that we use with inside CRM because, of course, we have our own session management using things like the SID and the contextual information, which are passed inside the system. And it's really all to do with the idea of it's not the responsibility of the server to remember where you are within the conversation. It is down to the responsibility of the browser. So it's largely in our conversations, it's stateless in the conversations, and it's even in a way partially sessionless because we're not having to constantly remember things within the server, but mostly it's the idea that sessions would be useful for storing state information, but we don't do that with inside CRM. ASP pages can use cookies just like any page with inside a server. Cookies are not used with inside the Sage CRM main interface. They might be useful to you within inside a self-service implementation. I'm not going to talk about them now, but if you wanted to do some homework about them, there are a couple of blog articles which talk about cookies within self-service. And it is just a way of passing these text files to, again, help you store within the browser some of the contextual or session information that you might want as you're moving, as people move around. You could useful for storing things like preferences up in a up within the browser. There's another thing that you might see mention of, which is the global.asa file. This is an optional file in most ASP applications. There's an equivalent as well, by the way, for ASP.NET as well, but these are not used with inside a Sage CRM implementation because there's no need. You're declaring all of the objects, all of the things within library files, or you are referencing objects which sit inside CRM itself. So this is not something that means anything really to a CRM implementation. There are some things which become very obvious, very useful to us, and this is where we start to get to a point where we want to finish and make our pages look right. And if we think about our result page that I was using here, when I go and say I want to go into my CRM and I put in my form and then I go put this information in here, this doesn't look right at all. It'll take a little bit more work to get this looking right, but in the result page where we've got here, it certainly doesn't look right. It doesn't have all the menus that we would want it to have. So why doesn't it have all the menus? Well, if we look at the page source again, you know, it can't get much simpler than that. We have nothing written out. And we know that really an HTML page should, if it's arriving in a browser, and this is just HTML being served up to the browser, we should be structuring it so it has proper HTML and head. And you can imagine some browsers really going and getting upset if we haven't structured our HTML correctly. Certainly if we're starting to move into much more sophisticated mobile device sort of environments where we're having to think about XLST and the transformation of the XML that sits underneath it and so on, you know, style sheet transformations and things. But we can actually get CRM very easily to make sure our ASP pages fit correctly, and this is to do with the way in which we can start to build the output. Now, this relies on the idea of looking at our code and saying, well, what are the objects that we can use from within our library. And there are two things that we use within our page. This is the idea of the construction of the page using add content and the get page. We don't use inside the core environment of CRM in our extensions, we don't use response.write directly. It's used, but only to pass the information into the idea of the page. And what we would do at this point is to start to create our structure. And I want to be able to look here and say CRM. Now that might be a bit strange to use CRM. I'm going to use add content. Now CRM add content is actually an object that exists and defines inside the resources of CRM. So it's one of the objects, and it's CRM.add content is paired then with the idea of get page. So this content represents the HTML that we're generating, and we can then render the page by saying CRM, or I should actually say response.write, because we do actually have to write it out in the end. But what we do is then say CRM.getPage. This is going to, in a CRM page, wrap everything with the correct furniture. And I now go back into my browser. I go back to that initial calling page. Let's go all the way through. So if I am on my CRM and I go into my form, this page isn't building the page in that way. So if I do this and say Susan May, or I can't spell Susan, there we are, Suzanne May, and I hit submit, what we can see now is that it has rendered the page correctly. If I right mouse click and view the page source, do you remember how simple it was before? It just had those letters and numbers rendered out. If I look and view the page source now, suddenly it's got all of the structure that an HTML document requires. So it's declaring it as an HTML document type, it's got the header, it's got the body tags, and it's got all of the includes, which now even go to the extent of including the client-side JavaScript API, as well as all of the references, all of the menu structures, everything. So you can see the complexity that is adding in for us. Now, if it didn't do that, we would have to do it. If it didn't add in the style guide references, then we would have to do it. And you can see suddenly why the API that we use inside CRM really is a first-class environment to be able to create quick pages in a simple scripting environment. So where do we go from here? We are going to carry on, and we're going to use all of these topics that we've looked at, the idea of the variables that we look at the different objects that we've looked at, and including the response and query string, as we use the ASP pages to extend CRM so that we can work with a custom entity or a linked entity in an external database to be able to create list pages and search pages, etc. like that. We'll be doing a lot of work in the next two lessons on extensions to CRM, but we'll then build on that as well to look at the idea of self-service where we can construct pages where we're really very much free to be able to make the page work in any way you like, because we're using the returned information from CRM in a much more flexible way. Remember that there's material on the community that you can access, so that there's whole sets of resources that, in terms of blog articles, that you can read. There are downloads which go into, there's also, for the SDK that I've been using, that you can download that and make sure that you've got that. You've got all of the stuff that you can access to be able to use. And you shouldn't fall shy of using those in looking for help. Okay, we come to the end of the session. I said it would last 90 minutes and we're bang on the money. So hopefully this has been a useful session to you. Let's see if there are any questions.